Hey y'all, we are the Stewarts. My husband, Russell, is an artist, and I am May, and I have an interest in true crime. We decided to merge our two interests together. Enjoy this calming visual while listening to a tragic story. This is Stewart and Crime. Warning: this episode contains crimes against children. Listener discretion is advised. I love Halloween. My whole family loves this holiday. Well, that may be a stretch. I'm actually not sure if my extended family loves it as much as me. And one of my sisters. She and I will plan the whole family's costume themes, sometimes a year in advance. One year, we all dressed as characters from Scooby-Doo. In 2019, all of our kids dressed up as Pokemon, and we were their trainers. And in 2020, we were all Mario Kart characters. However, we are not really into the creepy, spooky side of Halloween, but love the dressing up, gathering with family and friends, and of course, the candy. So where did this tradition start? According to History.com, Halloween's origins date back to the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. The Celts who lived about 2,000 years ago, mostly in the area that is now Ireland, the United Kingdom, and northern France, celebrated their new year on November 1st. For the Celts, this day marked the end of summer and the harvest and the beginning of the dark, cold winter, often associated with human death. Celts believed that on the night before the new year, the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead became blurred. On the night of October 31st, they celebrated Samhain, when it was believed that the ghosts of the dead returned to Earth. To commemorate the event, Druids built huge sacred bonfires, where the people gathered to burn crops and animals as sacrifices to the Celtic deities. And during this celebration, the Celts wore costumes, typically consisting of animal heads and skins, and would attempt to tell each other's fortunes. By 43 AD, the Roman Empire had conquered the majority of Celtic territory, and brought with them two festivals. The first was Feria, a day in late October when the Romans traditionally commemorated the passing of the dead. The second was a day to honor Pomona, the Roman goddess of fruit and trees. In the course of the 400 years that the Romans ruled the Celtic lands, the two festivals were combined with the traditional Celtic celebration of Samhain. On May 13th, 609 AD, Pope Boniface IV dedicated the Pantheon in Rome in honor of all Christian martyrs, and the Catholic feast of All Martyrs' Day was established in the Western Church. Pope Gregory III later expanded the festival to include All Saints, as well as All Martyrs, and moved the observation from May 13th to November 1st. All Saints' Day was also called All Hallows, or All Hallowmas, from Middle English All Hallowmas, meaning All Saints' Day, and the night before it, the traditional Night of Samhain in the Celtic religion, began to be called All Hallows' Eve, and eventually Halloween. By the 9th century, the influence of Christianity had spread into Celtic lands, where it gradually blended from the older Celtic rites. In 1000 AD, the Church made November 2nd All Souls' Day, a day to honor the dead that was celebrated similarly to Samhain, with big bonfires, parades, and dressing up in costumes as saints, angels, and devils. As the beliefs and customs of different European ethnic groups and the American Indians meshed, a distinctly American version of Halloween began to emerge. The first celebrations included play parties, which were public events held to celebrate the harvest. Neighbors would share stories of the dead, tell each other's fortunes, dance, and sing. Colonial Halloween festivities also featured the telling of ghost stories and mischief-making of all kinds. By the middle of the 19th century, annual autumn festivities were common, but Halloween was not yet celebrated everywhere in the country. By the second half of the 19th century, however, America was flooded with new immigrants. Among these new immigrants were millions of Irish fleeing the Irish potato famine. They were the ones who helped to popularize the celebration of Halloween nationally. Borrowing from European traditions, Americans began to dress up in costumes and go house to house asking for food or money, a practice that eventually became today's trick-or-treat tradition. Young women believed that on Halloween they could divine the name or appearance of their future husband by doing tricks with yarn, apple parings, or mirrors. By the late 1800s, there was a move in America to mold Halloween into a holiday more about community and neighborly get-togethers than about ghosts, pranks, and witchcraft. Halloween parties became the most common way to celebrate the day. These parties focused on games, foods of the season, and festive costumes. Parents were encouraged by newspapers and community leaders to take anything frightening or grotesque out of Halloween celebrations. And because of these efforts, Halloween lost most of its superstitious and religious overtones by the beginning of the 20th century. By the 1920s and 1930s, Halloween had become a secular but community-centered holiday, with parades and town-wide Halloween parties as the featured entertainment. Yet in many communities during this time, vandalism began to plague some celebrations. Town leaders had successfully limited vandalism by the 1950s, and Halloween had evolved into a holiday directed mainly towards children. Parties moved from town civic centers into the classroom or home, and the practice of trick-or-treating came back during this time as well. Trick-or-treating was a relatively inexpensive way for an entire community to share the Halloween celebration. In theory, families could also prevent tricks from being played on them by providing the neighborhood children with small treats. All of this helped to create the Halloween tradition that we all know today. But this day, no matter how fun, will always be known as one of the darkest holidays, with spooky and dark continually attached to its name. Halloween night, 2011. 55-year-old Chicago resident Liddell Peoples realized his candy bag was missing. He blamed neighbor Maria Adams for the missing sweets, confronted her, and a fight broke out, which ended with him stabbing her to death with several steak knives. Liddell Peoples was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Halloween 2010, an Oregon woman bought one of those graveyard decoration kits at a local Kmart, but forgot about it until 2012. When she eventually opened it, she found a note inside. The note, written by a Chinese factory worker, claimed he and others were being tortured and enslaved in a forced labor camp, making toys 15 hours a day with no pay or days off. He went on to plead for the letter to be forwarded to the World Humane Rights Organization. The woman went to work on doing just that. The author of the letter had already gotten out of the camp by this time. But 4 months after the story went viral, a Chinese magazine called Lens published an expose about conditions inside Mazenjia. The online version of the story was later deleted. But the Chinese authorities appeared to have been shaken by the publicity because shortly afterwards the government announced that it was ending the education through labor system and freed around 160,000 prisoners. On October 27, 2005, in Frederica, Delaware, many people drove by a dead body hanging from a tree, believing it to be a Halloween decoration. For hours, people passed by, admiring it, until around 11 a.m. when it was realized this was no decoration, but a real body. Police believe the 42-year-old woman committed suicide. In 1992, a 16-year-old Japanese foreign exchange student, Yoshihiro Hattori, went to live with his host family in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On October 17th, Yoshi, dressed as John Travolta from Saturday Night Fever, and his friend Webb, the son of the host family, was dressed as an accident victim. The pair were off to a Halloween party when they got turned around and went up to the wrong house. Webb and Yoshi knocked on the door but got no answer, and then saw a woman open the side garage door, peer out at them, but quickly slammed it in their faces. Webb started to walk away down the street, but Yoshi was still at the front door when it opened, with a man standing there holding a gun. Yoshi, thinking this was some Halloween prank, sang, "We're here for the party," but the man yelled, "Freeze!" Yoshi, confused, stepped toward the man and was shot in the chest. He died on the way to the hospital. The shooter was arrested, but later acquitted of the crime. On Halloween Day in 1955, Marilyn Damon went to a food fair on Long Island to do some shopping with her young children, 2-year-old Stephen and 7-month-old Pamela. She left the children outside while she went into the store, telling Stephen to be good and watch his little sister. She returned 10 minutes later to find that her children had disappeared. The 7-month-old was found a few yards away, still safe in her stroller, but the 2-year-old could not be found. A few days later, the family received a ransom note demanding $3,000 for his return. Sadly, it is still unknown what happened to little Stephen Damon. But nothing I just explained is as terrifying as the story of the man who ruined Halloween. Ronald Clark O'Brien was a 30-year-old husband to Daneen and father of 2 children, Timothy 8 and Elizabeth 5, in 1974. O'Brien was working as an optician at Texas State Optical Company and was also considered an upstanding citizen in his community, acting as a chairman of the parent-teacher organization in his neighborhood, and was very active in his Baptist church, one who handled the bus ministry project and was a volunteer for the church youth programs, even teaching a Baptist training class. But behind this facade, no one, not even his wife, could imagine the dark thoughts he had planned for that Halloween. Behind this picture-perfect image everyone saw, O'Brien was drowning in debt. His current job only paid $150 a week, which barely covered food and rent, and like so many other jobs over the last 10 years, 21 to be exact, he was on the brink of being fired after his employer suspected him of stealing money. The reason for being fired from the other jobs was either negligence or fraudulent behavior. He was more than $100,000 in debt, had defaulted on several bank loans, and his car was on the verge of being repossessed. The O'Briens even had to sell their home to help make other payments. The friends and acquaintances Ronald O'Brien couldn't hide his financial troubles from said he didn't seem worried and even told them that he was expecting to receive some money by the end of the year. O'Brien started working to make this into a reality. First, he substantially increased the life insurance coverage on his 2 children, each now having policies worth $30,000 each. Then in August 1974, O'Brien tried to obtain cyanide from where he worked, but was unsuccessful. So he called upon a colleague, chemist Bob Terry, whom he had met in 1970 while working as a lab tech at Atlantic Richfield in Pasadena, Texas. The two talked on the phone about the middle of September. This is when O'Brien started asking questions about cyanide under the guise of taking a chemistry course and was curious about the subject. O'Brien had asked Terry if just anybody could buy cyanide, and Terry told him no, not just anybody. O'Brien also asked how much cyanide it would take to be fatal. Terry didn't respond, but instead questioned O'Brien why he needed to know all this. O'Brien only replied he was just curious. A few days before Halloween, O'Brien went into a chemical outlet store in Houston called Curtin Matheson Scientific Company in search for cyanide. But when he realized they only sold it in large quantities, O'Brien asked the employee where he may be able to purchase a smaller amount. The day had finally arrived, Halloween 1974. O'Brien could now implement his perfect plan to help ease his financial worries. That Halloween evening, the O'Brien family was invited over to their friends, the Bates, home to have dinner and then take the kids out trick-or-treating in the Bates neighborhood after. This outing would include adults Ronald O'Brien and Jimmy Bates, and children Timothy and Elizabeth O'Brien, Mark Bates, and the other Bates child to get their Halloween candy. The night seemed like a pretty normal night of Halloween fun, running up to houses, knocking, cheerfully singing, trick-or-treat, and running off to the next house to score some more sugary treats. One house the kids went up to was dark, but the kids still decided it was worth knocking to see if maybe they forgot to turn on their light. But when no one answered, the kids took off running to the next home, leaving O'Brien on the darkened doorstep. After about 30 seconds, Mr. Bates saw O'Brien come from the house to the street, waving around giant Pixy Stix, exclaiming that rich neighbors were handing out expensive treats and told the kids he would hold on to the sticks for them. Unfortunately, it started to rain, so the group decided to end the night earlier than planned and head back to the Bates home. Once there, O'Brien handed out the Pixy Stix, one to each of the 4 children, and ended up giving the 5th one to a lone trick-or-treater that came by the house. While Danine went to go visit with a friend, O'Brien and the kids made their way home. He told his children they could have one piece of candy before bed. 5-year-old Elizabeth took a small treat and went off to bed, but 8-year-old Timmy grabbed the biggest candy from the pile, the giant Pixy Stick. He couldn't get the sugar out of the tube, so O'Brien rolled the tube between his hands to break it up and gave it back to his son. Once Timmy had some, he pulled it from his lips and said it tasted bitter. O'Brien gave him some Kool-Aid to wash it down and then sent him off to bed. Timmy never made it to bed. He immediately became violently ill and ran to the bathroom to vomit. O'Brien ran to Timmy, who was now suffering convulsions, grabbed his son, and felt him go limp in his arms. O'Brien called an ambulance, and Timmy was rushed to the hospital. But within an hour, he was dead. Cyanide was found in fluids aspirated from his stomach and in his blood. The quantity of cyanide in the blood was well above the fatal human dose, and a pathology report revealed that the Pixy Stix had been laced with potassium cyanide. The wrappers had been opened and poisoned before being resealed with a stapler. Thankfully, none of the other children who had gotten Pixy Stix that evening had eaten them, as all their parents said no when asked if they could have this particular candy before bed. After Timmy's death and the discovery of the cyanide, the police picked up the bags of candy from the kids who had gone trick-or-treating with the O'Briens. After Timmy's death and the discovery of the cyanide, the police picked up all the bags of candy from the kids who had gone trick-or-treating with the O'Briens. Every Pixy Stick contained cyanide. The community was enraged that some madman was purposely trying to kill as many kids as possible. The police went on the hunt to catch this poisoner. The day after his son's death, O'Brien sang a solo in church. The hymn, Blessed Assurance. He had changed the chorus from "This is my story, this is my song," to "This is Tim's story, this is Tim's song." Parishioners throughout the building wept. On the same day, an appeal came from the Pasadena Police Department asking for parents to bring in their children's Halloween candy. They obliged, and sacks full of sweets were brought in. Concerned parents turned in vast quantities of candy. Others, to the dismay of their children, destroyed their Halloween loot. No other candy was found to be poisoned except for the Pixy Stix they had confiscated from the O'Brien group. Ronald O'Brien offered little help when interviewed on Halloween night, shortly after Timothy's death. He told police the candy eaten by the boy was a giant pixie stick. O'Brien said he was given the candy while escorting his 2 children and the Bates children on a trick-or-treat outing. During this interview, and another the next day, O'Brien could not tell officers the description of the house, where he had gotten the candy, or the person who handed it out. He said he couldn't even be sure if it was a man or a woman. But on November 2nd, O'Brien began to get his memory back and was able to locate the house where he got the candy and was also able to give a detailed description of the man who handed it out. Later that day, police escorted O'Brien down a street in the Bowling Green subdivision, where O'Brien pointed out the house and named Courtney E. Melvin as the man who gave him the candy during the trick-or-treat outing. But this plan of O'Brien's to frame Melvin failed. As it turned out, Melvin was at Hobby Airport all of the Halloween night, working as an airline dispatcher for Texas International. His alibi was also corroborated by fellow worker Kenneth R. Poe. The police were confused and started looking at O'Brien with skepticism. Their thoughts toward the father were further confirmed after the police received a phone call from an insurance agent who informed them that, unknown to his wife, O'Brien had taken out policies on his 2 children shortly before Halloween. After some digging, the police learned of all the financial struggles O'Brien was dealing with, and after a search of his home, they found O'Brien's pocket knife with traces of plastic and powdered candy stuck to the blade. Further investigation led them to finding out about O'Brien's phone call to an old colleague inquiring about cyanide, and his trip to the chemical outlet store. Ronald O'Brien was arrested for his son's murder on November 5, 1974. Captain R.E. Rhodes from the Pasadena Police Department released this statement. At this time, we cannot comment as to any other aspect of this case or any statements made by any of the parties involved due to the legal aspects involved. The Pasadena Police Department would like to praise the conscientious cooperation of the citizens of the neighborhood where the investigation was conducted, and the many offers of assistance from citizens. We must not comment further for fear of jeopardizing the case. Obviously, we and the district attorney felt there is sufficient evidence for a charge to be filed. We are wrapping up some loose ends of the investigation. O'Brien was well known in the community, and this news came with disbelief and shock, with the neighbors remarking such statements as, "Until I hear his own statement that he did it, I'll never believe it," said W.C. Gill, a friend who lived next door. And, "There has to be a foul-up somewhere. I don't feel that he could do that at all," said another neighbor, E.W. Parrish. Even the pastor of the church O'Brien attended said he talked to O'Brien, and he is very torn up and puzzled. He doesn't have any idea of why the police charged him, and he re-emphasized his innocence, said Reverend Jimmy Jones, who went on to say, "We're a very close church. The members have reacted with shock and disbelief." Ronald O'Brien was indicted by a grand jury on November 12th, on 4 charges of attempted capital murder in connection with the alleged attempt to poison his 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth and 3 other children, and 1 charge of capital murder for the proceeds of life insurance on the life of Timothy, his son. The district attorney's office decided to seek the death penalty in this case, which they were allowed to under the statute of murder for profit. The trial was scheduled to start January 6, 1975, but was pushed back in order for O'Brien to take psychiatric tests. The assistant district attorney explained, "Due to the circumstances surrounding the alleged commission of the offenses, psychiatric examination is proper and just, not only for protection of the state's case, but for the defense as well. The accused's mental state at the time of the alleged offense will be a critical issue at the trial." It took about 2 weeks for all the jurors to be selected, 10 men and 2 women, and trial testimony was scheduled to start May 19, 1975. The prosecution planned to call 35 witnesses, and the defense were going to allow O'Brien to take the stand in his own defense.
Most of today's testimony came from Jimmy Bates, a close friend of the O'Brien family. Bates said that before Halloween, O'Brien asked if he could bring his children over to trick-or-treat with the Bates children on Halloween night. Both families ate dinner together, and then the fathers took the children trick-or-treating. Bates said O'Brien went to one house where no one appeared to be home, and after the children had scampered ahead to the next house, O'Brien came off the front porch carrying the Pixy Stix. He gave the Pixy Stix to the children and then later took them back and said he wanted to stop at his car for a moment. Bates said when O'Brien came back into the Bates house, he returned the Pixy Stix to the children. Later that night, Timothy O'Brien died from eating a poisoned Pixy stick.
That was audio from a reporter covering the O'Brien case in 1975. On June 3rd, the jury deliberated only 46 minutes before finding O'Brien guilty of the poisoning murder of his 8-year-old son, Timothy. During the sentencing phase, the defense lawyers called upon 9 witnesses who testified that they believed O'Brien would never commit criminal acts of violence, and the defense urged the jury to believe them because it took courage for them to testify for a man already convicted of killing his son. But on cross-examination, the defense witnesses admitted they knew little about the evidence in this case. The assistant district attorney, Mike Hinton, made these closing remarks to the jury. "Can you imagine what this has done to Halloween night? How many more years will it be before we have another normal Halloween? O'Brien is a cold-blooded killer without hope of rehabilitation or repentance. We have a duty to future innocent victims to carve this cancer out of society forever. By your verdict of death, by removing this cancer, you would deter everybody who would ever commit a like crime." The judge dismissed the jurors to consider 2 issues. 1. Consider whether or not O'Brien committed the act deliberately with reasonable expectation that it would result in death. And 2, whether or not O'Brien was capable of criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society. A death sentence would require an affirmative answer to both questions, and if 10 or more jurors voted negative to either questions, the sentence would automatically be life imprisonment. After 71 minutes, the jury answered, "We do," to both questions. Ronald O'Brien was sentenced to death. After hearing his sentence, O'Brien remarked, "I am innocent of what I have been convicted of. I think the jury made a rash decision. Of course I'm upset, but I don't feel this is the end. I think we have a long road yet to go. I'm amazed at the decision the jury made, yet I am confident that in the long run everything will turn out. I do believe in our jury system and in our courts." Halloween 1975 came around, and with it being the year anniversary of Timmy's death, precautions were being made to make sure this horrific event would not happen again. The City Council for Deer Park even approved the cancellation of trick-or-treating in their neighborhood and asked citizens to participate in other activities on Halloween night. By 1977, the other charges of attempted murder were still pending against O'Brien, but would end up being dismissed if the death sentence conviction was upheld. With all the new protocols, the community now dubbed O'Brien as the man who ruined Halloween. District Attorney Mike Hinton stated, "Our kids are restricted to going only to homes we personally know, and all our friends, either in or out of law enforcement, have the same policy." But on death row, his fellow inmates gave O'Brien the nickname, the Candy Man. Even with all the negativity, O'Brien's attorney said that O'Brien is in good spirits, and he also hopes nothing bad happens this Halloween. On the other hand, he still maintains his innocence on this thing and hopes that, whoever the culprit is, someday, we will catch him. Two other frequent visitors for O'Brien are his father and brother. Reverend Jimmy Jones was also a frequent visitor in the early death row days, but hasn't been in over a year, and explained, "I don't suppose it will ever be forgotten. I think most of us would like it to be forgotten, but we don't talk about it. I don't care to discuss it." O'Brien's wife, Daneen, does not visit and has since divorced him. In June 1980, the Supreme Court refused to hear O'Brien's appeal for a new trial, and Judge Price, who resided over his case, gave him an execution date of August 8, 1980. At this hearing, O'Brien addressed the judge, stating, "I now must appeal to a higher authority, and trust they will see through what the court calls the dispensing of justice, when in actuality it is the dispensing of injustice, and the grandest form of taking a human life." Later he said he was innocent and the victim of speculation, accusation, and said this case mocks the very justice of our system of justice. Texas allowed interviews with men on death row on Wednesdays from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Requests for these interviews must be submitted no later than noon on Monday prior to the desired Wednesday. And all interviews are to take place in the unit's regular visitation area. This rule is the same today as it was in 1980. Ronald O'Brien gave an interview on July 9, 1980. This is a portion of that interview. "Tim was very close to me. I never did anything to that boy. I loved him. I taught him to ride his bike, did a lot of things together. Fishing, playing ball, just wrestling around. About Tim's death, I felt anger, and then sadness, and then depression. I wanted somebody to pay for the death of my son. The police were looking for somebody to convict. I became the scapegoat. I was convicted of something I didn't do." What he said to the judge in no way meant that he wanted to die soon, only that the sentencing be done quickly so he could appeal to a higher court. And that higher court simply meant a higher legal court, not to God, as some writers thought I meant. I hope and pray the higher courts of this nation will see that I have been done an injustice. There has been so much publicity on my case. I believe it has influenced the courts. The courts just won't get down and look at my case. I had nothing to do with the death of my son. The police wanted to convict somebody, and I was convicted. Now everybody says, leave it alone. We have our scapegoat. We have someone to blame. But if one judge, just one, would take the time to read the transcripts, he would understand there is not testimony based on facts. It is all circumstantial.
When you have only circumstantial evidence, each link must be put together before you can make a noose. That noose, in my case, is non-existent. Even the key witness for the state couldn't identify me. I can prove I was never in some places where witnesses said I was. If some judge would just take the time, he would know I need a new trial. I don't like being on death row because I don't deserve to be here. You know, we had a big chinaberry tree in our yard, and Tim and I and some other kids in the neighborhood would get together and have chinaberry fights, like I did as a kid. I never drank, never smoked, never took any drugs, and never went any place I couldn't take my son and my daughter. The honky-tonk life wasn't for me. I am a Christian.
O'Brien was not executed on August 8, 1980, but was instead granted a stay of execution. His new execution date was scheduled for May 25, 1982. However, he was granted a stay of execution again. The new judge presiding over the case, Michael McSpadden, decided to make an impression when choosing the next execution date for O'Brien, October 31st, 1982, the 8-year anniversary of his son's death. It is no accident. I picked it for you especially. I hope it is the last execution date I set for you. I thought that would be very appropriate for him. He's ruined Halloween for everybody. If there was ever a case that deserved the death penalty, this is the one. He's been sentenced something like 4 or 5 times. He's had something like 7 years of appeals. The defense saw this execution date as a ridiculous stunt for show as McSpadden was being challenged in re-election. He was appointed January 8th to fill a vacancy left when Judge Frank Price was named to the appeals court post. Defense attorney Will Gray was quoted as saying, "It looks to me like it beats buying a bunch of billboards. He has no jurisdiction. A void proceeding just to get publicity. You execute someone on Halloween so a state judge can get some votes." The judge denied a stay of execution, and if this execution went as planned, O'Brien would be the first to be executed in Texas since 1964, and would be the first ever to die by lethal injection. The defense felt this was a ploy for attention and wrote a petition to the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals on October 26th. In this petition, the attorneys characterized O'Brien as a dreamer and with a peaceful nature, and that jurors who recommended the death penalty did not give enough consideration to his peaceful nature. There is no evidence that Mr. O'Brien had a prior criminal record or that he ever committed an act of violence in the past. Mr. O'Brien admitted to living beyond his means because he wanted his family to live as well as possible. He was a dreamer. He dreamed the very best he could get for himself and his family. It was also brought up in this petition that there were 3 jurors who had been excluded from the trial for reservations toward the death penalty. The defense said these actions constituted jury misconduct, and if true, it would be grounds for a new trial. What they were referring to stemmed from a 1968 ruling in Witherspoon v. Illinois, when the Supreme Court set aside a defendant's death sentence because members of the jury pool had been excluded solely because they had conscientious scruples against capital punishment. The court held that a potential juror could not be excused for cause on the basis of his opposition to the death penalty unless he was irrevocably committed before the trial had begun to vote against the penalty of death regardless of the facts and circumstances that might emerge in the course of the proceedings. At least 17 persons were excused for cause from serving on the jury on the basis of their opposition to the death penalty in O'Brien's case. O'Brien is challenging the exclusion of 3 of them: jurors Wells, Pfeffer, and Bowman. Such persons may be excluded only if they make it unmistakably clear that 1. They would automatically vote against the imposition of capital punishment without regard to any evidence that might be developed at the trial or the case before them, or 2. That their attitude toward the death penalty would prevent them from making an impartial decision as to the defendant's guilt. A 3-panel federal appeals court in New Orleans granted O'Brien a stay of execution October 27, 1982. But Texas officials really pushed for the U.S. Supreme Court justice to overrule the appeals court. Attorney General Mark White asked Supreme Court Justice Byron White to lift the stay and permit the execution to proceed, stating, "Nobody likes to see an execution occur. Our job is to see that the law is upheld, and that's what we're doing." If the Attorney General is successful and the court dissolves the stay of execution on Friday the 29th, the state said they plan to carry out the execution as scheduled between 12:01 a.m. and sunrise on October 31st. Officials from the Texas Department of Corrections said, "There isn't a whole lot of preparations needed for it. Now that we're using lethal injection, it's not as much of a chore as the electric chair. We don't have to get them up early to shave their heads." One corrections officer further stated he was reasonably sure that the state had done some simulations and walkthroughs to ensure that there are no snags if the sentence is carried out over the weekend. If this execution was to be carried out, it would make O'Brien the first in Texas to be executed since the death penalty was reinstated, and the first in the United States to be executed by lethal injection. But in an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the appeals court's decision, and O'Brien was granted a new hearing set for early the next year in New Orleans. The panel majority said O'Brien's attorneys had raised substantial questions concerning jury selection. The court explaining, "We cannot possibly give adequate review to his claims in the few days remaining before his scheduled execution." So it went back to the appeals court, and in a 2-1 opinion, the appeals court majority concluded that a substantial question was raised by O'Brien's claims that his trial was unfair because 3 people who expressed reservations about the death penalty were excluded from the jury. They also ordered expedited hearings on the issues raised in the appeal, and the case would be heard during the week of January 24, 1983. The man who ruined Halloween hit a new spike in 1982, as candy sales were down in large Houston areas. Small towns, however, didn't seem too affected, as there was more trust that the candy wouldn't be contaminated. This particular dip in sales couldn't fully be blamed on O'Brien, though, as the Tylenol poisonings in Chicago had just occurred in late September 1982. To give a little background on the Tylenol murders of 1982, on September 29, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up feeling a little under the weather, with symptoms such as a sore throat and a runny nose. So her parents told her to take 1 extra-strength Tylenol capsule. By 7 a.m., Mary was dead. The capsule had been laced with cyanide. That same day, 27-year-old Adam Jonas died from what was believed to be a massive heart attack. Family arrived at his home to comfort each other, when Adam's brother Stanley, 25, and sister-in-law Teresa, 19, both began experiencing throbbing headaches and looked through Adam's medicine cabinet. They found a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, and both took 1 or 2 of the capsules. Stanley died on the same day as his brother, and Teresa died 2 days later, all from cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. Over the next few days, 3 more strange deaths occurred. 35-year-old Mary McFarland, 35-year-old Paula Prince, and 27-year-old Mary Weiner. It turned out all of them took Tylenol shortly before they died. The perpetrator of these Chicago-based murders remains a mystery. On top of these two horrific cases of cyanide-laced items, there were also reports of contaminated candy that had discouraged residents of even buying Halloween candy. One store owner who was interviewed said, "We still have plenty of candy. Customers are leery of buying plastic bags of candy that have little holes in them. When that happens, we remove the bag from the shelf. It's usually kids that have torn a hole in the bag to get the candy." Because of all these heightened worries, several hospitals in Tarrant County, Houston, St. Louis, and in Sioux City, Iowa, used X-ray machines to check candy for metal objects. This got me curious if hospitals still do this, and I was surprised to find that as of 2015, this service was still offered, but I have not seen this particular service advertised since that year. Before I continue, I would like to pause the case and explain the process of appeals for death row inmates, as my understanding has always been a little blurry on the subject. And since this case forced me to really research the appeals process, I thought I would share the details with y'all. When someone is sentenced to death, they are given an automatic appeal that is made to the state's highest court, in which someone can seek an appeal from a conviction and death sentence, but only on issues that were presented in trial. This is called a direct appeal. The second step in the appeals process is called post-conviction. This petition is first filed with the original trial judge, then appealed to any intermediate court, and then eventually to the state's highest court. At this time, the defendant may raise issues surrounding the conviction and sentence that are outside of the record presented at trial. There are strict timelines that must be followed when filing this appeal, and missing a timeline may end a defendant's appeals. The defendant may again choose to petition the U.S. Supreme Court for a writ of certiorari. If the court denies the writ, the defendant has exhausted all state remedies, and the case can be continued in federal court. The final stage of the appeals process is a federal habeas corpus, which is limited to federal issues raised on appeal in the state courts. This process consists of 3 levels. 1. A petition to the U.S. District Court is the first step in federal post-conviction review. 2. Permissions to appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals is not automatic and must be granted by the U.S. District Court or the Court of Appeals. 3. The U.S. Supreme Court is the last resort for defendants appealing their death sentence. If all appeals have been exhausted, the only last chance a defendant has is executive clemency, in which a governor has the power to postpone an execution in order to allow time for further review, or may commute a defendant's death sentence to a lesser sentence, such as life without parole. Huge shout out to Capital Punishment and Context.org for helping me to better understand this process. During the time Ronald O'Brien was going through his appeals, the Supreme Court upheld a ruling that would make for a speedier appeals process, all due to a case for a man named Thomas Barefoot. Barefoot's first appeals were denied, but in January of 1983, just 83 hours before his scheduled execution, Barefoot was granted a stay by the U.S. Supreme Court. He had not exhausted all appeals, so a decision like this one usually triggered no complaints. But 1 month earlier, in December, an almost identical case was brought to the Supreme Court and rejected. The case of Charlie Brooks, another Texas murderer, was not granted a stay, even though he had not exhausted all of his appeals. These 2 cases sparked many questions about the Supreme Court's capital punishment approach. that had many death row mates worried. But after this decision, O'Brien was quoted as saying,
"I can think of a lot worse things than death. To me, this is not really living. This decision is what I hoped for."
The High Court suggested the following guidelines for death row inmates from this point forward. 1. Death row inmates seeking execution postponement must make a substantial showing that they have been deprived of some federally insured right. 2. When federal trial judges deny execution delays, but allow the inmate to carry last-minute pleas to federal appeals courts, the higher courts must consider the merits of the inmate's appeals. And 3. Postponements of executions are not automatic just because death row inmates have formal appeals pending before the Supreme Court. Then in January 1984, the Supreme Court rejected proportionality review in death penalty cases. This ruling meant that state courts may impose the death penalty without comparing the punishment to that given to others who committed similar crimes. By a 7-2 vote, the Supreme Court said the Constitution's protections against cruel and unusual punishment do not impose an absolute requirement that all death sentences be compared with penalties imposed in similar cases. After this decision, Texas Attorney General Jim Maddox stated, "I think there's a good chance there will be an execution in that time period, within 6 months for sure. We could get down eventually where you could have 8 to 10 in a yearly period, clearing the way for Texas to execute Autry and O'Brien, who will be running neck and neck towards execution." James Autry and Ronald O'Brien were next-door neighbors in the death row unit. Autry was convicted of shooting Shirley Drought, a 43 Port Arthur convenience store clerk. She was shot between the eyes for a 6-pack of beer on April 20th, 1980. Autry was scheduled to be executed on October 5th, 1983. But when all 155 men on death row were listening to the radio to hear of Autry's fate, they learned Autry had been granted a stay of execution while the needle was in his arm. He nearly escaped death by seconds. Back in his cell, he relayed the events to O'Brien, that O'Brien later explained to reporters in an interview.
"Guards tricked Autry into entering the death chamber. Autry told me that the guards came into his cell at 11 p.m. and said that they wanted him to wait in the next room. But when he walked inside, there were no chairs, just the gurney. Then 5 or 6 of those big old country rednecks descended on him and strapped him down, and he just laid there. They didn't have to descend on him like a pack of wolves. Autry said he was scared as he lay on the gurney, and said his only thoughts were that he was going to die and never get up off this table again." O'Brien stated further, "Any time an execution is carried out to the extent that Autry's was, you certainly have to give your own a thought as a possibility."
The reporters then informed O'Brien about the events that were going on outside the execution walls the night Autry was to die. They told him that an angry crowd had gathered, consisting mainly of Sam Houston State University students shouting, "Give us the Candyman! Give us the Candyman next!" To this, O'Brien replied,
"I have no hard feelings toward the crowd. All through history, there always have been mobs at revolutions, at executions. There are people who are going to ride the tide. In my case, received a lot of publicity."
Autry and O'Brien received new execution dates, both to be in March 1984, along with 2 other death row inmates. Autry was to be put to death March 14th. The other executions were scheduled for March 19th and March 30th, with O'Brien's execution scheduled for March 31st. Throughout March, O'Brien gave interviews every Wednesday on death row. On a March 7th interview, O'Brien said,
The public was outraged by the death of his son and directed that anger towards him. As a result, people forgot the relationship, that I had lost a son. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking that they understand the relationship. I loved Timmy very much. I got him his first bike. I put him on his first horse. I taught him how to fish. I wrestled him in the backyard. We had a very close relationship. Timmy's death was like someone reached in and ripped out my heart. I had nothing whatsoever to do with the death of my son. He expected to see Timmy again, saying, "It would be a very fond reunion and a very loving scene." And even though he believes his conviction to be unjust, he said his case may serve society by helping parents be more cautious with their children. The tragedy helped parents realize how fragile their children's safety is.
March 14th, Autry was executed, and O'Brien gave another interview. During this interview, he was told that Attorney General Maddox predicted O'Brien would be the next to be executed, as he had figured the other two scheduled executions would get a stay. O'Brien responded,
"If Mr. Maddox has some sort of crystal ball that allows him to see into the future with 100% accuracy, I'd like to have such a device." He told reporters he still expects to get a stay of execution and to get his capital murder conviction reversed. He said life in the shadow of an execution date gives him an advantage over other people. I suppose that some people would fear death who don't have their lives in order. I do. Death holds no sting or fear for me. If you're asking me why I'm not depressed or excited, I look at it this way. Dying is a part of living. We're all going to die.
March 20th, the Supreme Court denied O'Brien a stay of execution. On March 28th, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles refused to grant O'Brien a 90-day reprieve. On this day, O'Brien gave another death row interview, with it truly seeming like his execution would happen this time around. When asked of his emotional state, O'Brien said,
"I've always associated fear with guilt and guilt with fear, to the point that it causes a person to withdraw within themselves. I have stated from the very beginning that I had absolutely nothing at all to do with this. I maintain that now."
Then reporters asked about evidence from the 1975 trial.
He claims he could not have hidden the 21-inch long Pixy Stix packages during the trick-or-treating and insists that he got them from a man he can't describe at a house he can't identify. The victim of this crime actually turns out to be me, my family, my father. It was my son who died. It took me 2 years of sitting down here before I could say, "Lord, whoever did it, I forgive them."
The others who went to visit O'Brien on that Wednesday were Charles Hudgens, stepfather of Whitney Parker, one of the boys who had also been given a poisoned pixie stick. He had some final questions for O'Brien, such as why O'Brien had not tried to find the person who he insists gave him the cyanide candy, and why O'Brien had never written to him or the other parents to explain his version of what happened. But O'Brien was so busy with other interviews that the only response Hudgens said he got was, "He told me he didn't know what to say to us. He said he had written letters and so forth, but I don't know what he meant. The courts have proved that he did it. He's had every opportunity that the system affords. The answer has to be yes. The execution has to take place." Tim O'Brien did not die. He was executed for dollars and cents. He was executed, the jury said, and I concur, by the person he probably trusted most. It would seem to me that the man who committed a crime of this magnitude doesn't have the human right to expect anything less for himself. Another visitor that Wednesday was 18-year-old Kim Lee Manganaro, a freshman from Texas A&M who was pen pals with O'Brien. O'Brien introduced himself by letter after an article she wrote opposing the death penalty was published last October in the Houston Post. In the first letter, he asked if it, her article, was some type of joke. The letter went on for her to write him. He even provided her references to look up. They ended up developing a warm friendship through the mail. I got a lot out of the relationship. He's a very good person, and I really care for him. During her visit with him, O'Brien asked her to be a witness for his execution. She reluctantly agreed, telling reporters later, "I'd rather not be there, but if I can in any way help him, I'll be there. I'm scared, very scared. I never truly believed they would go through with it." She is strongly opposed to the death penalty, and particularly for someone like O'Brien, who had been a deacon in his church and a respected member of the community. It is incomprehensible how anybody could kill a man like O'Brien. They don't get to see in him what I see. One very silent person during this whole case was O'Brien's ex-wife, Daneen, who at that time lived as privately as possible with her daughter, now 16, and new husband. Through her attorney, Mike Hinton, she stated, "Any tears I shed are for Tim, not for him, O'Brien. I lost any feeling I had for him a long time ago." Daneen and daughter Elizabeth refused to accept any insurance money from Timothy's death and believe O'Brien deserves to die. O'Brien has written many letters to his ex-wife and daughter, but all had been returned to him unopened. But he said he was not bitter, explaining,
"My feelings for my wife have not changed at all. My love for her has not changed. She was a very young woman when this happened, and a lot of pressure was put on her." He also said he doesn't have a grudge against the legal system. "I don't hold anything against these people. It's the people who make the laws, so we can't complain. I don't have anything against the system except that, in this case, it's made a very bad mistake."
Attorney Mike Hinton explained, "The damage has been done. She lost a son she loved very much. It's caused great apprehension to her and her daughter that it's taken this long, but she's willing to let the criminal justice system do its work." The justice system did do that work, and after 10 years, Ronald O'Brien was executed on March 31st, 1984. This was his last statement before death.
"What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. However, we as human beings do make mistakes and errors. This execution is one of those wrongs, yet doesn't mean our whole system of justice is wrong. Therefore, I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Also, to anyone I have offended in any way during my 39 years, I pray and ask your forgiveness, just as I forgive anyone who offended me in any way. And I pray and ask God's forgiveness for all of us, respectively, as human beings. To my loved ones, I extend my undying love. To those close to me, know in your hearts I love you one and all. God bless you all, and may God's best blessings be always yours. Ronald C. O'Brien. P.S. During my time here, I have been treated well by all TDC personnel.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button below. If you want to inquire about a commission, you can email Russell at russellstewart.art@gmail.com. You can watch Russell livestream his art on Twitch. And if you want to hear more true crime stories, you can subscribe to my podcast, Crimes of a Decade, a Texas true crime podcast. Now that we are done, make sure to wash the brush. Just beat the devil out of it.